Hello, welcome back. I'm going to read chapters 3 and 4 of Walk Two Moons, and chapter 3 starts on page 9. It's called Bravery. So if you want to go ahead and grab your book and make sure you're on that spot, or if you're doing the online reading, that you are starting at the beginning of chapter 3. Okay, so when we left off, Sal was just starting out the road trip with her grandparents, and we know that she lives in Ohio with her dad. Her mom is in Lewiston, Idaho, and not coming back. And so they're on this road trip to go see the mother. And on the way, she's telling the story of what happened that previous year with her friend Phoebe that she met when she moved to Ohio from Kentucky. Okay, so I'm going to pick up at the start of chapter 3. Bravery. Because I first saw Phoebe on the day my father and I moved to Euclid, I began my story of Phoebe with a visit to the red-headed Margaret Cadavers, where I also met Mrs. Partridge, her elderly mother. Margaret nearly fell over herself being nice to me. "What lovely hair," she said, "and aren't you sweet?" I was not sweet that day. I was being particularly ornery. I wouldn't sit down and I wouldn't look at Margaret. As we were leaving, Margaret whispered to my father, "John, have you told her how we met?" My father looked uncomfortable. "No," he said, "I tried, but she doesn't want to know." Now that was the truth, absolutely. Who cares, I thought, who cares how he met Margaret Cadaver? I'm at the top of page 10. When at last we left Mrs. Cadaver and Mrs. Partridge, we drove for approximately 3 minutes. 2 blocks from Margaret Cadaver's was the place where my father and I were now going to live. So Mrs. Cadaver, Margaret Cadaver, is the redheaded woman that the father has some kind of friendship with, and Sal does not like this or like her. Mrs. Partridge is Mrs. Cadaver's mother. And you assume they have different last names because, probably because Mrs. Cadaver, well, obviously she's Mrs., so she must have married at some point and changed her maiden name of Partridge to her married name Cadaver. So right down the block, 2 blocks down, is where the dad and Sal are now going to live. It starts with tiny squirt trees. Tiny squirt trees, little birdhouses in a row, and one of those birdhouses was ours. No swimming hole, no barn, no cows, no chickens, no pigs. Instead, a little white house with a miniature patch of green grass in front of it. It wasn't enough grass to keep a cow alive for 5 minutes. "Let's take a tour," my father said, rather too heartily. We walked through the tiny living room into the miniature kitchen and upstairs into my father's pint-sized bedroom and on into my pocket-sized bedroom and into the wee bathroom. I looked out the upstairs window down into the backyard. Half of the tiny yard was a cement patio, and the other half was another patch of grass that our imaginary cow would devour in 2 bites. There was a tall wooden fence all around the yard, and to the left and right of our yard were other identical fenced plots. After the moving van arrived and the 2 men crammed our Bybanks furniture into our birdhouse, my father and I inched into the living room, crawling over sofas and chairs and tables and boxes. My father said. "It looks as if we tried to squeeze all the animals into the chicken coop." 3 days later, I started school and I saw Phoebe again. Remember that she had seen her the first time in the window next to Margaret Cadaver's house. Phoebe is Margaret's neighbor. She was in my class. Most of the kids in my new school spoke in quick, sharp bursts and dressed in stiff new clothes and wore braces on their teeth. Most girls wore their hair in exactly the same way, in a shoulder-length bob, that's what they called it, with long bangs that they repeatedly shook out of their eyes. We once had a horse who did that. Everybody kept touching my hair. "Don't you ever cut it?" they said. "Can you sit on it? How do you wash it? Is it naturally black like that? Do you use conditioner?" I couldn't tell if they liked my hair or if they thought I looked like a whangdoodle. One girl, Mary Lou Finney, said the most peculiar things. Like out of the blue, she would say, "Omnipotent," or "beef brain." I couldn't make any sense of it. There were Megan and Christy, who jumped up and down like parched peas, moody Beth Ann, and pink-cheeked Alex. There was Ben, who drew cartoons all day long, and a peculiar English teacher named Mr. Berkway. And then there was Phoebe Winterbottom. Ben called her Free Bee Icebottom and drew a picture of a bumblebee with an ice cube on its bottom. Phoebe tore it up. Phoebe was a quiet girl who stayed mostly by herself. Top of page 12. She had a pleasant round face and huge, enormous sky blue eyes. Around this pleasant round face, her hair, as yellow as a crow's foot, curled in short ringlets. During that first week when my father and I were at Margaret's, we ate dinner there 3 times that week, I saw Phoebe's face twice more at her window. Once I waved at her, but she didn't seem to notice, and at school she never mentioned that she'd seen me. Then one day at lunch she slid into the seat next to me and said, "Sal, you're so courageous. You're ever so brave." To tell you the truth, I was surprised. You could have knocked me over with a chicken feather. Me? I'm not brave, I said. You are brave. I was not. I, Salamanca Tree Hiddle, was afraid of lots and lots of things. For example, I was terrified of car accidents, death, cancer, brain tumors, nuclear war, pregnant women, loud noises, strict teachers, elevators, and scads of other things. But I was not afraid of spiders, snakes, and wasps. Phoebe and nearly everyone else in my new class did not have much fondness for these creatures. But on that day when a dignified black spider was investigating my desk, I cupped my hands around it, carried it to the open window, and set it outside on the ledge. Mary Lou Finney said, "Alpha and Omega, will you look at that?" Beth Ann was as white as milk. All around the room, people were acting as if I had single-handedly taken on a fire-breathing dragon. So you kind of get the sense here that Sal is unusual to these kids. She's a country girl. She's not afraid of animals or spiders or snakes. And these kids seem shocked by that she's not afraid of those things. And they also kind of look at her hair and say how long and dark it is. And it's kind of interesting to them because she's, the new kid. So they're all curious about her. I'm at the second paragraph down, top of 13. What I have since realized is that if people expect you to be brave, sometimes you pretend that you are, even when you are frightened down to your very bones. But this was later, during the whole thing with Phoebe's lunatic, that I realized this. At this point in my story, Graham interrupted me to say, "Why, Salamanca, of course you're brave. All the Hiddles are brave. It's a family trait. Look at your daddy, your mama." "Mama's not a real Hiddle," I said. "She practically is," Graham said. "You can't be married to a Hiddle that long and not become a Hiddle." That is not what my mother used to say. She would tell my father, "You Hiddles are a mystery to me. I'll never be a true Hiddle." She did not say this proudly. She said it as if she were sorry about it, as if it were some sort of failing in her. My mother's parents, my other set of grandparents, are Pickfords, and they are as unlike my grandparents' Hiddle as a donkey is unlike a pickle. Grandmother and grandfather Pickford stand straight up as if sturdy steel poles ran down their backs. They wear starched, ironed clothing, and when they look shocked or surprised, which is often, they say, "Really, is that so?" And their eyes open wide and their mouths turn down at the corners. Once I asked my mother why grandmother and grandfather Pickford never laughed. My mother said, "They're just so busy being respectable. It takes a lot of concentration to be that respectable." And then my mother laughed and laughed in a gentle way, and you could tell her own spine was not made of steel because she bent in half, laughing and laughing. My mother said that grandmother Pickford's one act of defiance in her whole life as a Pickford was in naming her. Grandmother Pickford, whose own name is Gayfeather, named my mother Chanhassen. It's an Indian name meaning tree sweet juice, or, in other words, maple sugar. Only Grandmother Pickford ever called my mother by her Indian name, though. Everyone else called my mother Sugar. Most of the time, my mother seemed nothing like her parents at all, and it was hard for me to imagine that she had come from them. But occasionally, in small, unexpected moments, the corners of my mother's mouth would turn down, and she'd say, "Really? Is that so?" and sound exactly like a Pickford. So we get a sense of the mom here a little bit, that she had parents. Her parents are the Pickfords, and that they were kind of uptight, respectable, maybe not having a great sense of humor, but that the mom herself was mostly not like that, that the mom was gentle and liked to laugh, except occasionally her likeness to her own parents would show through. And so in the book, the important things to remember is that the mother is named Chanhassen, but her nickname is Sugar. Everybody except her mom calls her Sugar. Okay, so when they refer to that in the book, that's meaning Sal's mom. Chapter 4 starts on page 15, and it's called That's What I'm Telling You. On the day that Phoebe sat next to me at lunch and told me I was brave, she invited me to her house for dinner. To be honest, I was relieved that I would not have to eat at Margaret's again. I did not want to see Dad and Margaret smiling at each other. I wanted everything to be like it was. I wanted to be back in Bybanks, Kentucky, in the hills and the trees, near the cows and chickens and pigs. I wanted to run down the hill from the barn and through the kitchen door that banged behind me, and see my mother and my father sitting at the table peeling apples. Phoebe and I walked home from school together. We stopped briefly at my house so that I could call my father at work. Margaret had helped him find a job selling farm machinery. He said it made him happy as a clam at high water to know I had a new friend. Maybe this is really why he was happy, I thought, or maybe it was because he could be alone with Margaret Cadaver. Phoebe and I then walked to her house. As we passed Margaret Cadaver's house, remember that Phoebe and Margaret are neighbors, a voice called out, "Sal? Sal, is that you?" In the shadows on the porch, Margaret's mother, Mrs. Partridge, sat in a wicker rocker. A thick, gnarled cane with a handle carved in the shape of a cobra's head lay across her knees. Her purple dress had slipped up over her bony knees, which were spread apart, and I hate to say it, but you could see right up her skirt. Around her neck was a yellow feather scarf. "My boa," she once told me, "my most favoritest boa." As I started up the walk, Phoebe pulled on my arm. "Don't go up there," she said. "It's only Mrs. Partridge," I said. "Come on." "Who's that with you?" Mrs. Partridge said. "What's that on her face?" I knew what she was going to do. She did this with me the first time I met her. Phoebe placed her hands on her own round face and felt about. "Come here," Mrs. Partridge said. She wriggled her crooked little fingers at Phoebe. Mrs. Partridge put her fingers up to Phoebe's face and mashed around gently around her eyelids and down her cheeks. "Just as I thought. It's 2 eyes, a nose, and a mouth." Mrs. Partridge laughed a wicked laugh that sounded as if it were bouncing off jagged rocks. "You're 13 years old." "Yes," Phoebe said. "I knew it," Mrs. Partridge said. "I just knew it." She patted her yellow feather boa. "This is Phoebe Winterbottom," I said. "She lives right next door to you." When we left, Phoebe whispered, "I wish you hadn't done that. I wish you hadn't told her I lived next door." "Why not? You don't seem to know Mrs. Cadaver and Mrs. Partridge very well." "They haven't lived there very long, only a month or so." "Don't you think it's remarkable that she guessed your age?" "I don't see what is so remarkable about it." Before I could explain, Phoebe started telling me about the time that she and her mother, father, and sister, Prudence, had gone to the state fair. At one booth, a crowd was gathered around a tall, thin man. "So what was he doing?" I asked. "That's what I'm telling you," Phoebe said. Phoebe had a way of sounding like a grown-up sometimes. Top of 18. When she said, "That's what I'm telling you," she sounded like a grown-up talking to a child. What he was doing was guessing people's ages. All around, people were saying, "Oh, and amazing, and how does he do that?" He had to guess your correct age within 1 year, or else you won a teddy bear. "How did he do it?" I asked. That's what I'm telling you, Phoebe said. The thin man would look someone over carefully, close his eyes, and then he would point his finger at the person and shout, 72! At everyone? He guessed everyone to be 72? Sal, she said, that's what I am trying to tell you. I was just giving an example. He might have said 10 or 30 or 72. It just depended on the person. He was astounding. I really thought it was more astounding that Mrs. Partridge could do this, but I didn't say anything. Phoebe's father wanted the thin man to guess his age. My father thinks he looks very young, and he was certain he could fool the man. After studying my father, the thin man closed his eyes, pointed his finger at my father, and shouted, 52! My father gave a little yelp, and all around people were automatically saying, oh, and amazing, and all that. But my father stopped them. Why? Phoebe pulled on one of her yellow curls. I think she wished she hadn't started this story in the first place. Because he wasn't anywhere near 52. He was only 38. Oh. And all day long my father followed us through the fair, carrying his prize, a large green teddy bear. He was miserable. He kept saying, 52? 52? Do I look 52? Does he? I said. I'm going to pause the video for a second because my dog is scratching at the door and making noise, so I will be back in a sec.